This is not a GBA. In fact, it's the Anbernic RG34XX. Thank you very much to Anbernic for sending this out to me for review. This marks yet another handheld from Anbernic that is using the H700 chipset, which is admittedly a very low cost yet still very performant chipset that has found its way in many Anbernic devices this year for good reason. Now, for this particular form factor in particular, you're really only going to play GBA games, and we'll explain that a little bit more. First, let's back up a little. In the event that you do not know what the H700 chipset is capable of, let's first just talk about the specs. So what we have on offer for the specs, effectively, the H700 finds its main foundation being the quad-core ARM Cortex-A53 CPUs running at 1.5 gigahertz. It has an ARM Mali G31 GPU, 1 gigabyte of LPDDR4, which is honestly more than enough for what types of things that this is capable of running. They did bump up the microSD to 32 gigabytes, which is nice because it seems that the 16 gig and 32 gig are essentially around the same price from where they're sourcing these from. So it's nice to see a bump there as well, but that is still the base version. You can spend more by going up in tiers in different microSDs from Anbernic themselves, which you don't need to get. It does also feature 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, which is very good for retro treatments, net play, and all that other stuff. It does have Bluetooth 4.2, but honestly, the big ticket item here that is more important and probably the most important, especially for this form factor and how it's designed, is this 3.4-inch 3:2 aspect ratio 720 by 480 display. This is effectively 3 times the resolution of what you're going to find on a GBA itself, and the end result being that you're going to have games that are from the GBA looking really good on this particular handheld. So that is more or less what the specs of the RG34XX are. Now, I still have my original GBA that I purchased from an import shop a long time ago. And in fact, I installed the Afterburner mod on this, which some of you may not know because it came out 20 some odd years ago, 22 some odd years ago. This came out before the GBA SP was even a thing, which is why the Afterburner was so needed, because that was a front-facing, a front light, not even a backlight. It was a front light on top of the display so that you could view this in the dark. So this is one of the only ways that you can actually play GBA games, because the original GBA was much like the original Game Boy in that it didn't have a backlit display. So you still needed to look into it with a light to actually play games. And not until the GBA SP did it have a backlight on it. So when we compare the original GBA SP to the RG34XDX, you may not even know this, but there were emulators written for the GBA itself. So I'm doing NES emulation on the GBA, running Spy Hunter here, and this is what it looks like compared to the RG34XDX. Now, obviously, the RG34XDX is also doing aspect ratio scaling so that it is better for 1:1 to how the Nintendo would output. So we are stretching it on the original GBA SP, whereas we're making it a little bit more native and perfect for the RG34XDX. Even comparing the Nintendo version of Tetris running on the GBA versus the Nintendo version of Tetris running on the RG34XX, there are 2 things that I want to highlight for you here. The first one being that the original GBA did not have a backlit display, and even with an Afterburner mod with a frontlit display mod, that there is a lot of fidelity that is lost on the original unit, whereas the RG34XX with a more modern display looks leagues better. The other part is that what I'm trying to finesse here with you guys is that running Nintendo games, running Genesis games, running TurboGrafx games, PlayStation games, even though all of that is going to be possible on the RG34XX, it's really not an ideal screen aspect ratio to run those particular games. So what winds up happening is, even though the H700 is more than capable of running a lot of these types of emulators, the end result is that it's not something that I would actually recommend that you do. Now, you can scale it out and stretch it out so that it fits the entire display, but then it's kind of gross to do that, and it's not going to be a pleasant experience. There's other better retro handhelds that are out there that'll give you more screen real estate area while offering a better fit inside of those aspect ratios. So really what it comes down to is that the RG34XX really finds itself only kind of playing GBA games as almost an exclusive. Now, if that's what you're after, then there's a few things that we can talk about, and I'll get to all of the build quality and everything on this device in just a moment. But I just want to briefly catapult into the next part of this video where, since we already talked about specs, what can you do with those specs? And basically what it comes down to is that everything up to Dreamcast. Now, you may think Dreamcast would be harder to run this, but Dreamcast is actually an easier to emulate system despite it being fundamentally more powerful. But you can play Dreamcast games on this, even though, again, the aspect ratio isn't ideal for it. So you can go up to Dreamcast, and the generation below Saturn is where you're going to have a lot of misses on this particular handheld. While it can do a number of Saturn games, there are going to be some that will flat out not work at all. And then there's going to be others that are just quite buggy to the point of unplayability. Now, what you can tell is that it's going to be using Yabashan Shiro to run everything, and the version that they're running is just not ideal for a lot of Saturn emulation. So if you had any hopes of running Saturn emulation on this for any particular reason, this is not going to be it. So with Saturn emulation being the one outlier as to the one particular part of that generation that you won't be able to run so well on this particular device, everything that's under there can run reasonably well. Now, obviously, we don't have any analog sticks on this, so if we were to think about it from that angle, yeah, it's not the best to do it in that area either. So we're really restricting ourselves to a very to a smaller subset of the types of emulation that you're going to have on this particular handheld. PlayStation does work well, and we do also have 4 shoulder buttons. Now, the additional L2 and R2 are spaced far enough away that I found no particular way where they were comfortable at all to actually use in game. It is quite awkward, and even using additional fingers, there's no particular arrangement where I found that to be good to use anywhere. So what I like for these particular L2 and R2 is really just for hotkey purposes, which it's out of the way enough that I would never actually use it accidentally, and it's fine enough to hit and be precise where I want to hit for hotkey purposes. So I do like the inclusion of the L2 and R2, but if we're thinking of them for in use in actuality, like during gameplay for some PlayStation games that need L1, L2, R1, R2, that is also a big miss for this particular form factor and how it's all netting out. So it's a bit interesting overall. Like, there's lots of hits and misses. PlayStation, even with the 3:2 aspect ratio, still kind of fills out the screen kind of nice. And it's the one type of system, along with Genesis as well. Genesis resolution fits inside of this display pretty nicely. We're not giving up too much as well, and it looks decent enough there. But there's a whole smorgasbord of other emulators that just look really, really tiny on this display. And if you were going to spend $70, you can spend $70 on a fleet of other handhelds that will do a much better job with basically the same type of size device and offering you more. But the one thing that this does beat all of those on is GBA emulation. And that's where this thing really wins in spades. So since we've addressed the specs and what that means, like in actuality, what the reality of those specs actually do for us, and if we were to just look at this through the lens of using this for GBA exclusively, how close does this actually match an original GBA, the display notwithstanding? What winds up happening is the D-pad that is on here is slightly different. However, for all intents and purposes, in terms of feel, it winds up feeling very, very close to an original GBA. Now, it's not exactly the same. It's not a perfect one-to-one, but it is very, very close, despite the RG34XX being slightly larger and of a different design. Select and start are exactly where they feel like in the original GBA, and even the feel of pressing them down, the same type of membrane, feels exactly the same. The face buttons. Now, the face buttons, I actually like what Anbernic has done here with adding the 2 additional face buttons on top. Now, there are other GBA clones that have come out with like Raspberry Pis and whatever that have used the original GBA shell and just added additional buttons. I actually prefer what Anbernic has done here over other types of clones that have come out. The other thing is that these shoulder buttons do not feel like the original anyway, but again, it could just be that my GBA is forever old, so it's just worn out, but the type of feedback that I got on here feels like the button placement is in a completely different space, and the type of membrane that they have is far springier. These shoulder buttons feel far more close to what these face buttons are, whereas the ones that are on the original GBA feel feel a lot easier to depress and don't have as much spring to them. But again, it could just be because it's worn out. Outside of that, all of these things are pretty much the same. The one thing that I do find that Anbernic did that's pretty neat is the fake potentiometer that they have on here. Well, fake potentiometer is a potentiometer that does not keep on circling around. So you'll just push it to the right and it'll end, but it'll keep on acting as if you're rolling that potentiometer volume rocker. So you can increase volume, decrease volume. The single mono speaker is outrageously loud. Overall, when we compare it to being a GBA clone, Anbernic did a great job. They really did a great job. But this comes into a territory like, what are you doing? Because it feels like it's almost... Ultimately, what it comes down to is, can I recommend the RG34XDX? And it's a bit hard to recommend this specifically. You would have to have a very specific use case of why you wanted this. This is for almost purists that they want to have the closest approximation to what a original Game Boy Advance feels like without any of the downsides to an original GBA, that being the non-backlit display. Whereas this will be a very nice backlit display, and even though it's 3 times the resolution, it is still a 3:2 aspect ratio and fills in the screen quite nicely. So if that is what you were looking for, then that is one of the only avenues where I could possibly recommend this, because the reality is that Anbernic has already created the best H700 device months ago, and that's the RG35XDX SP. So this device is the one that I recommend out of all of Anbernic's H700 devices. This is the one that makes a lot of sense for me overall. I very much appreciate the clamshell design. I like the small bump in size over the original GBA SP. It has a lot of similarities to the GBA SP while making improvements that I personally find over the GBA SP. So if you wanted something that was in the GBA family, the RG35XDX SP is a better all-rounder, because playing other games on this, like other emulators, makes a lot more sense than doing it on this. So I find this one still to be the best, most recommendable. But if you like this particular form factor and, again, are only looking to play GBA games on it, then yeah, it is something that I can recommend, because it does a very good job of being an extremely close approximation of how the original Game Boy Advance was. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Really, your guys' support means the world to me. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.